Welcome for our second public program this spring at the Berkeley Institute. I want to note that tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Human Rights Center, the International Human Rights Law Clinic, both which are amazing initiatives in the law school, and thank you to Alexa Kuning, who I see. I'm not sure if I spot anyone else in the audience right now, and also with the Human Rights Program, which is an undergraduate initiative on campus. I'm Rebecca Goldberg, the Executive Director of the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. As many of you may know, the Berkeley Institute hosts two programs, the program on Israel Studies and the program on Jewish law, thought, and identity. As part of this latter program, the Berkeley Institute has an interest in exploring complex questions relating to the Holocaust and its aftermath, such as last spring's conference examining the legacy of the Nuremberg trials on their 70th anniversary. When my hope that Professor John Roth would participate in that conference were dashed, as he had other conflicting engagements, we arranged for him to come this spring in collaboration with the above-mentioned partners, the Human Rights Center, the Human Rights Law Clinic, and the Human Rights Program. While much of the work of the Berkeley Institute focuses on the Berkeley campus, bringing visiting faculty to campus, sponsoring courses, working closely with students and faculty, and creating programs, lectures, and conferences on a wide range of topics, we're pleased that public programs such as this one can bridge campus and the wider community, and we thank you for your ongoing support, which allows us to bring these amazing complementary programs to you. I want to flag a couple of our upcoming programs this spring, just for your knowledge. In February, in 2 days, we have an event with Avishai Braverman, who is a former World Bank economist, Knesset member, and Ben-Gurion University president. In March, we will host two speakers, Yosef Abramovitz of Energia Global Capital, who will be speaking about sustainable development in Israel and Africa, that is in frontier economies, and Princeton professor Jonathan Gribetz, who will be speaking based on his recent publication, Defining Neighbors, Religion, Race, and the Early Zionist Arab Encounter. In April, we will host Avi Weiss of the Taub Center for Social Policy Studies in Israel, and our annual Robbins Collection lecturer, Susanna Heschel, professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth, who will be speaking about Jewish scholars and the study of Islam, reflections on modern Jewish identity. Please see our brochures for additional information about upcoming events and opportunities for giving. And so now to tonight's event. I'm excited to introduce you to professor, philosopher, and Holocaust and genocide scholar John Roth, who will be drawing on themes from his newest book, The Failures of Ethics, Confronting the Holocaust, Genocide, and Other Mass Atrocities. John Roth is the Edward J. Sexton Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights, which is now the Magrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. Professor Roth has served on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. He received the Holocaust Education Foundation's Distinguished Achievement Award for Holocaust Studies and Research, and he has published extensively, grappling with questions of ethics, morality, and meaning after the Holocaust, genocide, and mass atrocity. Just a few of his books include Approaches to Auschwitz, The Holocaust and Its Legacy with Richard Rubinstein, Ethics During and After the Holocaust in the Shadow of Birkenau, Holocaust, Religious and Philosophical Implications with Michael Berenbaum, the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, and a series of books with Carol Rittner that include Different Voices, Women in the Holocaust, and Rape, Weapon of War and Genocide, and obviously his most recent book, The Failures of Ethics, Confronting the Holocaust, Genocide, and Other Mass Atrocities, which is the focus of his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Roth.
Are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
I succeeded in getting the switch turned from off to on, so I'm hoping it's working all right. I want to thank Rebecca Goldberg and her staff at the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies for inviting me to be here and hosting my visit. It's been a really interesting 2 days, and I look forward to our time together here this evening. On February 21st, 1944, just about exactly 72 years ago, an Italian Jewish chemist by the name of Primo Levi was among a group of Italian Jews who were deported from a camp in northern Italy to Auschwitz. Levi's transport to Auschwitz numbered about 650 people. He was one of 20 who survived it. Levi, as I'll explain in more detail as we get further into the talk, credited his survival of Auschwitz to another Italian person who was not Jewish, but who was a slave laborer in Auschwitz. His name was Lorenzo Perone. And his name and Levi's are listed on the board here, along with a few other names that I'll be mentioning as the talk proceeds. Levi learned from Lorenzo, his friend, that Lorenzo's philosophy of life emphasized a simple but bold and profound proposition, namely, as Lorenzo put it to Primo Levi, we are in this world to do good. We are in this world to do good. And that simple idea is sort of the epigraph, the text that will govern this talk tonight on what I call the failures of ethics, exploring confrontations with the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities. Defined by the intention to encourage human action that fits sound understanding about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, good and evil, virtuous and corrupt, ethics arguably is civilization's keystone. At its best, ethics emphasizes careful deliberation about the difference between right and wrong. Encouragement not to be indifferent toward that difference, cultivation of virtuous character, and action that defends what is right and resists what is wrong. Absent the overriding of moral sensibilities, if not the collapse or collaboration of ethical traditions, the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities could not take place. Confronting such disasters for more than 40 years, I have been following a thread that weaves its way through failure. Inescapable and pervasive failure riddles existence. Following that thread particularly compels me to contend with the failures of ethics. Exposing fault lines in nature and flaws in reality itself, those failures abound in the multiple shortfalls and shortcomings of thought, character, decision, and action that tempt us human beings to betray what is good, right, virtuous, and just, and incite us to do incalculable harm. With those themes forming the context, let's consider the proposition that especially in a world scarred by the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities, We are in this world to do good. Some moments from the history of the Holocaust can help to advance reflection that will focus on that event, but I hope extend to responding to the failures of ethics that have contributed to many other disasters too. In his book called Moments of Reprieve, the Italian Jew and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi recalled his friend Lorenzo Perone, the person Levi credited with saving his life in Auschwitz. Not a Jew, but an Italian civilian, Lorenzo, who was a skilled mason, was officially a voluntary worker helping to build the industrial plant that the Germans were constructing at a place known as Auschwitz III. Established in 1942, this subcamp in the vast Auschwitz complex, also called Buna or Monowitz, housed prisoners. Elie Wiesel as well as Levi were among them, who toiled at the synthetic rubber factory located on the outskirts of a Polish village. In fact, however, Lorenzo was more like a labor conscript, and he despised the German cruelty that he saw at Auschwitz. After meeting Levi in June of 1944, Lorenzo decided to help his fellow Italian, although it was a crime with grave consequences for Lorenzo even to speak to an Auschwitz prisoner. For months, Lorenzo got Levi extra food, which was the physical difference between life and death. I believe that it was really due to Lorenzo that I am alive today, Levi would write, underscoring that Lorenzo's help meant much more than food alone. What also sustained him was that Lorenzo, as Levi put it, constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror. Something, Levi said, difficult to define, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. When liberation came, Levi lost track of Lorenzo, but later he became determined to find out what had happened to his life-saving friend. They reconnected for a short time in Italy after the war, but soon Lorenzo died. At one of their post-war meetings, Levi learned that he was not the only Auschwitz prisoner whom Lorenzo had helped. But Levi's friend had rarely told that story. In Lorenzo's view, wrote Levi, we are in this world to do good, not to boast about it. Especially in his book, The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi explored what he called the gray zone. As Levi experienced and explored that Auschwitz region, he stressed that it contained surprises and shocks that revealed a world that was not only, as he said, terrible, but also indecipherable. It did not conform to any model. Levi did not mince words about the fact that the Holocaust epitomized wrongdoing, and never more so in his judgment than when the Germans created the Sonderkommando, those units of predominantly Jewish prisoners whose task it was to man the Auschwitz crematoria. Conceiving and organizing those squads, said Levi, was National Socialism's most demonic crime. Those clear and distinct moral judgments, however, mixed and mingled with two other dimensions of awareness that made Levy a much more complicated and profound ethical thinker. First, Levy saw that gray-zoned behavior could not be neatly analyzed in terms of right and wrong, at least not as most ethical traditions might try to do. Arguably, those traditions could still be used to judge the National Socialist perpetrators of the Holocaust, but their relevance was less clear for judging those who were conscripted into the Sonderkommando, let alone for determining what those hapless men should do, condemned as they were to a fate of choiceless choices before they too were murdered. Next, Levy saw how the gray zone revealed a tragic dysfunctionality for ethics. That dysfunctionality had at least two parts. First, traces of idealism about treating one's neighbor as oneself or of refusing to steal might remain in the gray zone, but within that region of experience, such teachings lost their appeal. As Levy put the point, the physiological reserves of the organism were consumed in 2 or 3 months, and death by hunger or by diseases induced by hunger was the prisoner's normal destiny, avoidable only with additional food. Obtaining that extra nourishment, Levy went on to say, required a privilege, large or small, granted or conquered, astute or violent, licit or illicit, whatever it took to lift oneself above the norm. Second, if the most basic ethical teachings lost their appeal in the gray zone, then that fact scarcely inspired confidence then or now that the world has a fundamental moral structure that can be trusted. True, Levy thought that at least sometimes, at least in part, historical crimes are punished, and that the Nazi project had been suicidal. But Levy's book, The Drowned and the Saved, was written overall in a minor key, and its chapter on the gray zone ends as follows. Willingly or not, said Levy, we come to terms with power, forgetting that we are all in the ghetto, that the ghetto is walled in, that outside the ghetto reign the lords of death, and that close by the train is waiting. Levy knew that a kind of logic governed Nazi thinking. He did not unpack, however, something implied by his insight, something that others have underscored in ways that not only are consistent with Levy's outlook, but also create additional worries about and for ethics, especially after the Holocaust. In 1988, for example, Peter Haas identified what he called the Nazi ethic. 15 years later, the historian Claudia Kuntz wrote about the Nazi conscience. That concept, she joined Haas to show, is not an oxymoron. On the contrary, Kuntz argued persuasively, the popularizers of anti-Semitism and the planners of genocide followed a coherent set of severe ethical maxims derived from broad philosophical concepts. Both Haas and Kuntz help to show that ethical reasoning can take multiple forms, which can be at lethal odds with one another. Kuntz made that point by referring to the German political theorist Carl Schmitt, who rejected universal human rights and argued in May 1933 that, quote, not every being with a human face is human. It's quite a concept. Not every being with a human face is human. One can and must argue that such reasoning is false and wrong, but arguments do not guarantee the triumph of rationality, especially when what counts as rational is not only arguable, but also a factor in struggles for power and political control. No one, I think, can take much comfort from saying, after its devastation was wreaked, that the Holocaust was wrong. The Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities signify immense human failures. They have done enormous harm to ethics by showing how ethical teachings can be overridden, rendered dysfunctional, or even subverted to serve the interests of genocide. That outcome creates an ongoing dilemma. Another Holocaust survivor, the philosopher Sarah Kaufman, identified this dilemma in a gut-level way. How is it possible to speak, she wrote in her memoir called Smothered Words, when you feel a strange double bind, an infinite claim to speak, a duty to speak infinitely, imposing itself with irrepressible force, and at the same time an almost physical impossibility to speak, a choking feeling. The Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities can create a duty to speak, an obligation to make ethics stronger and less subject to overriding, dysfunctionality, or subversion, an insistence not only to drive home the difference between right and wrong, but also to influence action accordingly. Yet such an obligation can also produce a choking feeling, a sense that too much harm has been done for a good recovery to be made, a suspicion that ethics may be overwhelmed by the challenges it faces. The bind is double, for the sense of ethical responsibility, real though it is, remains hopelessly optimistic and naive unless it grapples with the despair that encounters with the Holocaust are bound to produce. To be touched by that despair, however, scarcely encourages one to believe that ethical responsibilities will be accepted and met. Caught between the post-Holocaust need to speak for ethics, and above all to speak ethically and boldly on the one hand, and the feeling that the key elements of ethics, words, arguments, appeals to reason, persuasion through the example of moral action, may be inadequate on the other hand, the question persists, given what happened to ethics during the Holocaust, what can and should be made of ethics after Auschwitz? The Holocaust produced what Sarah Kaufman called knotted words, especially for the survivors. Such words, she suggested, are demanded and yet forbidden because for too long they have been internalized and withheld. Knotted words, she went on to say, stick in your throat and cause you to suffocate, to lose your breath. They asphyxiate you, she said, taking away the possibility of even beginning. Kaufman understood all too well what she was saying. For like some other important writers who survived the Holocaust, Primo Levi perhaps among them, she took her own life. Born in 1934, Sarah Kaufman was not yet 8 years old when her father was caught in the roundup of some 13,000 Parisian Jews that took place in mid-July of 1942. She survived as a hidden child, but she never saw her father again. Her father's death suffocated Kaufman, stifled her words. It did so, however, not simply because it was her father's death, grievous enough though a father's death can be for anyone. Because he was a Jew, as her stifled voice expresses it, my father died in Auschwitz. Kaufman's emphasis on smothered words, moreover, shows that her choking feeling was inseparable from the memory of how her father died at Auschwitz. My father, a rabbi, she writes, was killed because he tried to observe the Sabbath in the death camps. buried alive with a shovel for having, or so the witnesses reported, refused to work on that day in order to celebrate the Sabbath, to pray to God for them all, victims and executioners, reestablishing in this situation of extreme powerlessness and violence a relation beyond all power. And she adds, they could not bear that a Jew, that vermin, even in the camps, did not lose faith in God. Because he was a Jew, my father died in Auschwitz. Not just a father's death, but a particular Jewish father's death in its Auschwitz specificity, that event, which Kaufman calls my absolute, made the suffocating difference. All she had left of her father, Kaufman observed, was his fountain pen. Patched up with Scotch tape, she noted, it could produce words no more. But right in front of me on my desk, she says, that mute pen makes me write. As she thought about the idea of humanity after the Holocaust, for example, she saw that the value of a shared sense of humanity, of our belonging to a human species, depends on whether that belonging binds us together in mutual respect and caring, whether it draws people together in community. As Kaufman sized up the situation, however, the connections between the unity implied by the word humanity and the senses of community that may or may not follow are tenuous and even problematic. First, she pointed out, and I think this is a trenchant, powerful statement, she pointed out no community is possible with the SS. With a vengeance, Nazi ideology rejected the idea of an inclusively shared humanity, regarding difference, especially alleged racial difference, as profoundly threatening. Its genocidal impulses led to mass murder and Auschwitz. Nazi Germany, of course, took pride in its own sense of community, which underscores that community is not necessarily humanity's ally, especially if humanity is understood to be pluralistic and diverse. So Kaufman made a second point. It is crucial, she said, to support the community of those without community. Those without community are outsiders, but Kaufman's thinking did not stop with the call to defend and protect those who are threatened and harmed because they are left out. More radically and fundamentally, she rejected all senses of community that are based on any specific difference or on a shared essence, as she said. The right forms of community, Kaufman seems to be saying, are those that that consciously accept a double bind. This bind acknowledges that every community is particular, different, finite, even exclusive in one way or another, but no community should rest on assumptions about immutable superiority or inferiority. On the contrary, the particularity of one community ought to affirm, protect, and encourage the particularity of others. Here, Kaufman's words are not smothered or knotted, but they remain less than fully expressed. They remain or signposts pointing to an ethical outlook that would not be the same as old outlooks that appealed to human nature, to the essence of humanity, or to reason as humankind's most decisive characteristic. Instead, she suggests everyday realities and actions, things such as choices and keeping or betraying one's word, reveal our humanity and make all the difference. The Holocaust reaffirmed that all of those caught in it, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and more, were human. In some sense, humanity survived the Holocaust. But if humanity is to mean more than that, if humanity is to be what Kaufman thought it ought to become, then what she called A new kind of we must be envisioned and enacted. A new humanism, one might say, if it were still acceptable, she added, to use this trite and idyllic word. What about Kaufman's guarded hope? She glimpsed and emphasized the possibility of a new humanism and a new ethics, but the preeminent Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg seemed to stress a different theme, even one that disagreed with hers when he spoke at a conference on ethics after the Holocaust at the University of Oregon some years ago. Explaining that he did not consider himself a philosopher or a theologian, Hilberg asserted that ethics is the same today as it was yesterday and even the day before yesterday. It is the same after Auschwitz as it was before and during the lethal operations at that place. Especially with regard to needless and wanton killing, Hilberg emphasized, ethics is the same for everyone, everywhere. He left no unclarity. Such killing is wrong. We know that in our bones, he said, for such knowledge is the heritage of many years. Sarah Kaufman, I think, would accept Raoul Hilberg's claims only up to a point before conceding that his bold pronouncement unknots some of the words that ethics after Auschwitz needs to express. Senses of right and wrong are real. The Holocaust helps to focus them. Even the SS leader Heinrich Himmler knew as much. He and the other perpetrators of the Holocaust were aware of the psychological turmoil created by their orders to kill. They did their best to make those tasks easier, more humane, by distancing the killers from their victims. Thus, they substituted mass gassings for mass shootings. But did Himmler and the other perpetrators know in their bones that what they were doing was wrong? In some cases, there is evidence that says so. The perpetrators covered their tracks as best they could. Many of the killers numbed themselves with alcohol. Some Germans refused orders to kill Jews, especially when children were the targets. On the other hand, such evidence is mostly circumstantial. It was not very often enhanced by admissions of guilt or expressions of remorse. Far more common were excuses that referred to orders that must be obeyed or to fears of punishment if obedience was not forthcoming. For the most part, Nazi leaders and Holocaust perpetrators remained unrepentant. At the end of the day, their behavior does not show that they knew that their killing of the Jews was wanton, needless, and wrong. On the contrary, their behavior suggests that they believed their killing to be necessary, right, and good, albeit extremely difficult and even loathsome to do. It would be comforting if Hilberg's convictions were true, but the Holocaust does not inspire confidence that all human beings know in their bones or in any other way that mass killing and genocide are wrong. Kaufman was right. No community was possible with the SS because the SS did not think that the destruction of the European Jews was wrong. To see such action as wrong, as Kaufman also understood, depended on an entirely different approach to choosing and fidelity than Nazism required. To the extent that moral sensitivity complicated the killing that the perpetrators carried out month after month, year after year, those ethical impulses did have to be overridden. Himmler and his henchmen could rely on an ally of vast authority, human consciousness itself. Humanity's capacity to think is amazingly pliable, especially so in its ability to justify whatever the powers that be want done. The explanations offered by German industrialists to warrant their use of slave labor, for example, Germany was fighting for its life, what else could one do? Were only one strand in a web of rationalization and repression that did much to ensure that dissenting moral scruples would be subordinated to higher necessities, or even that the dictates of morality and mass murder would coincide. The Nazis were not totally successful in this regard, but when one remembers that the persons responsible for the Holocaust were a cross-section from virtually every profession, skill, and social class, then the persistence with which the final solution went forward without effective moral dissent is the more striking. Absent the force of will, nothing guarantees that ethics will not be smothered after the Holocaust as it was with such devastating results during that disaster. In our pluralistic world in which cultural, religious, and philosophical perspectives vary considerably, a widely held belief is that values are so relative to one's time and place that the truth of moral claims is much more a result of subjective preference and politics than a function of objective reality and universal reason. That relativistic outlook meets resistance in confronting the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities, for there is a widely shared conviction that such catastrophes are wrong. They should not have happened, and nothing akin to them should happen again. Michael Berenbaum puts the point effectively when he emphasizes that the Holocaust has become, at least to some extent, what he calls a negative absolute. Even if people remain skeptical that rational agreement can be obtained about what is right, just, and good, the Holocaust seems to reestablish conviction that what happened at Auschwitz and Treblinka was wrong, unjust, and evil, period. Unfortunately, to identify the Holocaust or any other genocide or mass atrocity as a negative absolute that reinstates confidence in moral absolutes is a step, as the gray zone reminds us, that cannot be taken easily. To reiterate an earlier point, the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities signify immense human failures. They harm ethics by showing how ethical teachings can be overridden, rendered dysfunctional, or even subverted to serve the interests of genocide. When Berenbaum calls the Holocaust a negative absolute, the absoluteness involved means that not even ethics itself was immune from failure, and at times complicity in the pathological conditions and characteristics that nearly destroyed Jewish life and left the world morally scarred forever. The gray-zoned status of ethics after the Holocaust is far from settled. One might argue that Nazi Germany's defeat shows that right defeated wrong and that goodness subdued evil, thus showing that reality does have a fundamentally moral underpinning. But the Holocaust is far too awesome for such an easy triumphalism, I think. The Nazis did not win, but they came too close for comfort. Even though the Third Reich was destroyed, it is not so easy to say that its defeat was a clear and decisive triumph for goodness, truth, and justice over evil, falsehood, and corruption. Add to those realizations the fact that the Nazis themselves were idealists. They had positive beliefs about right and wrong, good and evil, duty and irresponsibility. The final solution was a key part of the Nazi ethic, perhaps the essence of its practice, which took place with a zealous and even apocalyptic vengeance. It would be too convenient to assume that the Nazi ethic's characteristic blending of loyalty, faith, heroism, and even love for country and cause was simply a passive, mindless obedience. Most people are unlikely to serve a cause unto death unless that cause makes convincing moral appeals about what is good and worthy of loyalty. Those appeals, of course, can be blind, false, or even sinful, and the Nazis were. Nevertheless, the perceived and persuasive goodness of the beliefs that constituted the Nazi ethic, the dedicated SS man embodied them most thoroughly, is essential to acknowledge if we are to understand why so many Germans willfully followed Hitler into genocidal warfare. As Sarah Kaufman helped to show, our senses of moral and religious authority have been weakened by the accumulated ruins of history and the depersonalized advances of civilization that have taken us from a bloody 20th century into what may become an even more problematic 21st century. A moral spirit, a religious commitment, and a political determination that have the courage to persist in spite of humankind's self-inflicted destructiveness are essential. But the question remains how effective those dispositions can be in a world where power, and especially the power of governments, but also that of what are now referred to as non-state actors, stands at the heart of the matter. To find ways to affect the powers that be so that their tendencies to lay waste to human life are checked, ethics after the Holocaust needs to draw on every resource it can find. Appeals to human rights, calls for renewed religious sensitivity, respect and honor for people who save lives and resist tyranny, and attention to the Holocaust's warnings, to name only a few. Those efforts will need to be accompanied by work that builds these concerns into our educational, religious, business, and political institutions. Sarah Kaufman never forgot what the Nazi assault meant, namely that after July 16, 1942, she never saw her father, Barak Kaufman, again. Nazism and the Holocaust were an assault on the values that human beings hold most dear when we are at our best. Resistance to protect them came too late then, hence resistance continues to be urgent now, and it begins perpetually with small deeds, the raising of critical questions among them. Sarah Kaufman, her smothered words, the Holocaust double binds, each and all her hard-earned perspectives underscore that nothing human, natural, or divine guarantees respect for those values. Nothing, though, is more important than our commitment to defend them, for they remain as fundamental as they are fragile, as precious as they are endangered. About 100 years ago tonight, shortly after April 1915, when German forces unleashed the first major poisonous gas barrage in World War I, the Ottoman Turkish regime prepared to launch its state-planned genocide against the Armenian people. A little more than 70 years ago tonight, World War II approached its European ending, leaving enormous devastation and death in its wake. That carnage was evident at Buchenwald, the Nazi concentration camp liberated by American troops on April 11, 1945. Among the Jews who had been force marched from Auschwitz to that place a few months earlier was a teenage boy named Elie Wiesel. Eventually the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Wiesel reminds us, and these are his words, that indifference and resignation are not the answer. If life, mine or that of my fellow man, is not an offering to the other, says Wiesel, what are we doing on this earth? The Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust took place decades ago. But the novelist William Faulkner was right when he said that the past is never dead. It's not even past. It had been hoped that never again might be more than a slogan. But just 22 years ago this April, the Rwandan genocide began and very quickly was in full cry. In just 100 days, between 500,000 and 1 million Rwandans, predominantly Tutsi, were killed. As the more recent violence of ISIS and Boko Haram reveals presently, the impulses that lead to mass atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, continue to wreak havoc and inflict horrible suffering. Another Auschwitz survivor, the Jewish philosopher Jean Amari, who was tortured by the Nazis, speaks for our time as well as his. Somewhere, said Amari, someone is crying out under torture, perhaps in this hour, this second. The French philosopher Albert Camus thought that even by its greatest effort, humanity can only propose, as he said, to diminish arithmetically the sufferings of the world. But he insistently added, the injustice and the suffering of the world will not cease to be an outrage. That outlook led Camus to contemplate the fate of Sisyphus, the mythical Greek king who passionately loved life and defied fate by thwarting death itself. The gods condemned Sisyphus to a ceaseless repetition that required him to push a weighty rock up a mountain only to have it roll back to the bottom as he neared the top. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus depicted Sisyphus in ways that deserve remembering and heeding. At the very end of his long effort, wrote Camus, Sisyphus watches the stone rush down, whence he will have to push it up again toward the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It is during that return, that pause, said Camus, that Sisyphus interests me. If the descent, Camus went on to say, is sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. This word, said Camus, is not too much. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The joy that Camus had in mind was not sentimental, occasional, or fleeting. It was scarcely synonymous with fun. Resistant and resilient, the joy Camus had in mind was what I like to call an in spite of joy. Refusing to be driven to despair, such joy encourages study and defiance of atrocity, even if not always victoriously. Kindled and sustained by friendship, the help that we give as well as receive, by doing what is right and good, by love, such joy sustains solidarity with those who oppose and limit harm, relieve suffering, and save lives. Declining to give in or to give up, and in spite of joy, can keep people going, even though the work of studying, supporting, and defending human rights has no end, and at times may seem to be a forlorn cause. It has been remarked that moral beauty happens when someone carves out a place for compassion in a largely ruthless universe. So, as a postscript, recall once more Primo Levi's friend Lorenzo, who Levi said constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror, something difficult to define, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. Lorenzo's actions and Levy's testimony about them bear witness to insights that can make an immense difference if they are heeded. Levy may have been right in thinking, as he did, that no universal human conscience exists, that there is no innate and shared moral compass to guide us all if only we would pay attention and follow it. But that sensibility does not negate, at least not completely, the reminding presence of Lorenzo, which testifies that we are in this world to do good. Remote though it often seems, difficult to define though it may be, that possibility remains. More than that, the possibility becomes an imperative if the world is to be less corrupt and savage and more opposed to hatred and terror. Primo Levi, I think, was right to suggest that it is difficult to define precisely how it is that we are in this world to do good. But it was not difficult for Levi to feel Lorenzo's presence and to discern his natural and plain manner of being good. Those characteristics were oppression-resisting, hope-sustaining, death-defying, and life-giving. More often than not, ethics at its best involves reminders of the kind embedded in Lorenzo's actions. Reminders are not always welcome or followed, but good reminders of the kind that Lorenzo gave Levi are testimonies about sometimes difficult to define realities, justice, compassion, respect, love, that have been experienced, at least at times, in word and deed. Reminders about those realities may be especially acute when such qualities are threatened and in short supply. But Levi testified with insistence that Lorenzo's reminder, we are in this world to do good, should always be vivid and never abandoned. About as far from Auschwitz as one can get, the town of Winthrop is where I now make my home. It sits small in the Methow Valley, a place of spectacular beauty on the eastern slope of the majestic Cascade Range in the state of Washington. As I think about what has happened to ethics during and after the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities, my thoughts often include the poetry of William Stafford, who I think is an American national treasure, one of our great poets. He died about 20 years ago. Stafford's poems frequently focus on the natural world, often on our abuse of it. Also drenched in history, his verse laments the carnage we human beings inflict and encourages resistance against it. Although the Holocaust was not Stafford's theme, he knew plenty about war and genocide. In works such as The Darkness Around Us is Deep, he wondered whether ultimately only the darkness remains. His poem called Meditation, for example, goes as follows. Animals full of light walk through the forest toward someone aiming a gun loaded with darkness. That's the world, God holding still, letting it happen again and again and again. As I understand that brief poem, Stafford's words do not express resignation and despair, let alone indifference. They voice protest and the possibility of creative change instead. More than 20 years ago, two Methow Valley forest rangers, Curtis Edwards and Sheila McLean, friends of mine, contacted William Stafford and made an unusual request. Would he help them create what they called poetry road signs for the North Cascades Highway and its surroundings? Stafford agreed, and the result was a brilliant set that came to be called the Methow River Poems. Some of those poems appeared on the signs that can still be found here and there. I am particularly fond of one of Stafford's Methow River poems called Being a Person. It invites a reader, a viewer, to contemplate the Methow River as its clear, cold water rushes to the Columbia and then to the Pacific. Its reflections make a good ending and beginning for any stock-taking, but especially one that asks how we should respond to the failures of ethics that have contributed so decisively and destructively to the Holocaust, genocide, and other mass atrocities. Be a person here, writes Stafford. How you stand here is important. How you listen for the next things to happen. How you breathe. Whatever else they may require, lucid and effective responses to the failures of ethics before, during, and after the Holocaust, and to Lorenzo's affirmation that we are in this world to do good, are about those things. What we hear as we listen for what is happening, how we breathe, how we stand, nothing could be more important. So those are my reflections on the failures of ethics. And as I hope you could detect, I want to stand with Camus and Sisyphus. I think that's maybe where we are with regard to responding to the failures of ethics. So I think there's some time for some comments and questions, and so let's use the time for that. Yeah, please start here.
Thank you for your wonderful remarks. Sam Harris, one of the noted atheists, has seemingly trying to develop his concepts of ethics slightly differently, rather than defining a good, which he feels really only can be defined if you have a divinity type ethics. He tries to define his ethics by doing no harm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any feeling about that? I'm not sure he's completely succeeded.
I have a couple of comments to make. I never met him, but there was a legendary philosopher who taught for many years at Columbia University. His name was Sidney Morgenbesser. He was known for his kind of penetrating humor. And on one occasion, he was heard to say that there was a difference between what he called Kantian ethics, from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, where the idea is that if you ought to be able, if you ought to do something, it means that you can do it. Ought implies can is the formula. The professor said that in his understanding, Jewish ethics was different from that. Its basic proposition was can implies don't. And he meant this in a kind of shorthand, humorous way, recognizing that it was more complicated than that. But when I heard this story, I thought, yeah, he was really on to something there. That Kant was right. If you ought to be able to do something, if you ought to do something, then that would imply that you could do it, otherwise it wouldn't make much sense that you should or ought to do something. But Morgan Bester was right too. Can implies don't a lot of the times. So if the Nazis had only adhered to that as an ethical norm, that they could commit genocide, but don't do it, the world would be quite a different place. So I think that as I consider what I call the failures of ethics, and you could hear it in my remarks, I think to respond to these things, you have to look for resources wherever you can find them. There isn't going to be a single theory or a single tradition or a single outlook that's going to meet all the needs. But you look at it piecemeal. You find help from wherever you can get it. And when I was reading Primo Levi and first came to the passage where he was describing Lorenzo, I thought, here's one of the fragments. I think of ethics as being in kind of a fragmented condition in our time. And so you try to protect the fragments. You try to put them together in some kind of a mosaic, if you can, that adds strength to the individual parts. And this disarmingly simple proposition of Lorenzo's, we are in this world to do good, without having an elaborate theory to explain it or anything, but just to do what Levi saw in it, that he experienced, as he puts it, the presence of Lorenzo. It seems to me this has power that we would overlook or forget or underestimate at our peril. Please.
I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the ethical structures of societies and the ethical structures of societies when you talk about failure of ethics. And the reason I'm asking is the follows, just as background. Most of us are not going to be ever in a situation where we're going to find ourselves in a condition of being perpetrators or victims of mass atrocities.
Yes.
And I think most people don't think of it in advance. But nevertheless, in our everyday life, we take actions that may be ethical or actions may be unethical that contribute and generate a kind of social ethic.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you can say anything about societies in which atrocities occurred and the structure, the social ethics of human behavior that preceded it, and how do you think that compares with the ethics of our society today?
Yeah. Well, the Holocaust is illustrative of something here. That is that a social climate existed in Germany under the Nazis that heavily influenced the behavior and thinking of lots and lots of people who probably would not have acted as they turned out to act if the social climate had been different. We even are seeing, I think, in our own American life today, that there are some efforts to create a climate that might lead us to do some things that, in retrospect, if we look back and those things came to be the case, we might say, no, we weren't at our best at that moment. So the shaping of the climate is crucial. And there are always going to be the forces that produce division, suspicion, hatred, separation, and the ethical is something that ought to try to respond to that in a way that undercuts and criticizes the power of those things. But this is where ethics is fragile. This is part of my thinking about how come there is so much failure with regard to ethics. And I'm discussing it in the talk in terms of how the ethical can be overridden, it can turn dysfunctional, it can even be subverted. So the antidote to this is a reaffirmation, a resistance that emerges out of the ethical impulses. That in the case of our discussion tonight, would try to take to heart Levy's takeaway point from Lorenzo, or that would take away the point from Sarah Kaufman, that you can't make community with the SS. You can't do that. You're going to have to do something that will resist that, undercut it, ultimately defeat it. So I don't have a recipe for how all that plays out, but I think that's the problem and the dilemma and the antidote in principle, at least, for it. Probably not a completely reassuring and convincing response on my part, but I think that's where I think we are with regard to the fragmented nature of the ethical. You're right that many of us are not in a situation where that our issue is how to stop mass atrocities, although all of us can do more to resist those than we may sometimes think. But the fact that these things happen in the world does impact all of us because it weakens the ethical impulses. That's the thing we have to keep our eye on. It's harder to be good when the world is so bad. That's the nub of it. Who else? Do we have a little more time? Yes?
As you spoke about the Holocaust, it reminded me that I don't know. I'm a teacher. After the Holocaust, you thought, well, now this could never happen again. Surely we saw the worst, and yet it happened again. And so I keep thinking about today when I see Donald Trump, and I see his audiences, and I see what he says to them, and how they respond to him, and the hatefulness, and the how unethical all of this is, and then the pygmies who are around him and echo the same thing. Is there something in human beings that there's always this struggle between being good or doing good and being ethical and being responsive to all of these siren calls that are so evil?
Well, I think your question answers itself. Yes, there are forces and pressures that make it easier to go along than to speak out, make it easier to stand by than to get involved, make it easier to look the other way than to resist. We all know about this. I mean, that's why I said at the beginning that, my work has led me to follow this thread about failure. And all of us in this room know a ton about failure, right? I mean, and ethical failure. I can think of countless times when I should have spoken out in a faculty meeting or on my campus, and I didn't. So we all know a lot about this, and we know that that the failure, when it happens, is not a virtue. It's the opposite. So that awareness is one of the key things that can be part of an effective response to the failures of ethics. That we know, not necessarily in our bones or because there's some universal conscience, but just in our experience that we haven't done the best we can So with that insight, there's something to build on. And the other thing that's characteristic of the ethical that I take some encouragement from is that fragile though the ethical outlook is, things are easily overridden or subverted, there's something persistent about the ethical, what I call the ethical. It resides in part in questions that we all have. Questions that would say, is that right, what's going on here? Could we do better than we're doing? Does that seem like it's unjust, what's happening? The ethical impulse lives partly in the ability that we have as human beings to ask critical questions. It's that deep and that simple and that fragile. Because if we don't ask those questions, then, we just may go on uncritically and find ourselves in a mess before we know it. So the ethical is fragile and easily overridden, but it does have a kind of strength and resilience. And it can even reside to some extent, and this is why I like Camus and Sisyphus, in an attitude that says, and here, pardon my vulgarity, but it needs to be used here. Damn it, I'm not going to let the bastards win. Which doesn't mean that I may lay life on the line, but I'll find a way to do what I can to use the leverage I have to resist. That's an option. And I think in our time and in our world, we can do a lot worse than to remember Sisyphus and Camus' point that there can be a kind of joy in resisting and rebelling. It isn't a cheap or glib kind of joy, but it is something that can provide meaning and significance. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say that wasn't vulgar at all.
Okay.
And which bastards? Your bastards
Yeah.
may not be.
Yeah, right.
But I think we've got to, we have to understand that, for instance, I've lived long enough to, people are saying in Congress, oh, God, look what they're doing. They're not thinking about anything that is ethical. Talk about the Supreme Court. I've never seen the court like this. But I think when people, maybe they haven't lived long enough or heard enough or read enough, we've always had these situations. This isn't new. Nothing that's happening in Congress and what's going on is new. This thing in the Supreme Court is not new. My question to you, Dr. Roth, is how about outlining a place in history for me where what we're talking about now has not existed? In exactly this way. When did the ethical prevail? The Greek polis was, well, that wasn't very ethical because only a couple of people had rights and so forth. So, this sounds very cynical, but
yeah.
I'm just saying, I don't think we can have these big ideas. I think we have to do what you were saying. One day at a time, like Levy and Lorenzo did. I wonder if we can do anything different than that. A day-to-day basis with our friends and people we know.
Let's Roth respond.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
You're right. The ethical has never been in the ascendancy, let alone, in control. It's always involving a voice of dissent, of resistance, of protest. It's a minority kind of voice in many ways, but that's part of its power. Strangely enough, I mean, there are deep ironies in this. Its power is to some extent in its fragility and its weakness, because we know that the good doesn't prevail, but it calls to us, it beckons us, it can lure us. This is as ancient as, I'm a philosopher, so this is as ancient as Plato and Socrates. There's something that we can see by looking at our world and our history critically that says to us things could be different. They don't have to be the way they are. Now, this gets a little ambiguous because people can change as the Nazis wanted to change the world, or they can change in ways that resist those kinds of atrocities and things of that sort. So your basic point I take to be kind of the starting point, that is, the ethical is always in a kind of minority voice in terms of its power and authority, but it doesn't mean that it lacks power and authority. It beckons and calls and appeals and can make us respond in some ways. It's there. It's there in our questions. It's there in our traditions to some degree. I think very often about the commandment in the Decalogue, "You shall not murder." I mean, what ethical norm has been more overridden and disrespected and disregarded than that? And yet we know, I think, that if we didn't have an injunction against murder as part of the keystone of civilization, we would be in real difficulty, more than we are. And this relates to the Holocaust too, in my view. I think that what Hitler and the Nazis were intending to do was not only to kill Jewish people, but to kill the tradition, to obliterate the injunction against murder. Because to be a good Nazi, you had to be willing to kill, to murder, those who were regarded as, contrary to what your community was supposed to be. So, yeah.
What you're saying, I'm sure you're acquainted with Christopher Browning.
Yes?
I can hardly get this out, but he wrote that in the Nazi squads in Poland, courageous Nazis could smash babies and do all the horrible things, and that made you courageous and worthy of praise in your unit.
This is what I would call the subversion of ethics. The Nazi, I think Haas and Kuhns are right to speak of a Nazi ethic and a Nazi conscience. And it used the vocabulary of good and evil, right and wrong, virtuous and non-virtuous, to underwrite and perpetuate a genocidal regime. So this is a huge failure of ethics. We need to call a halt.
We're gonna close.
There's a lot more going
you
on
wanna
here.
say
I'll
that
stay up
first?
here
You
if
can
you
say
want
it,
to
people can
come up, but I think, maybe
wanna
we need to.
close with-
Yeah, I want to thank you for a kind of. I want to thank you for a vigorous conversation after the talk, and your takeaway point is remember Sisyphus, and if you can, think about that William Stafford poem, that it makes a difference how you stand and how we breathe. Makes a huge difference. So thank you.